Synopsis of the books of the Bible. Genesis. JND Darby. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, truly furnished unto all good works. 2 Timothy 3 verses 16 and 17. Synopsis of the books of the Bible. By John Nelson Darby. Genesis chapter 10 and 11. The history of the world after the deluge. Chapters 10 and 11 give us the history of the world as peopled and established after the deluge, and the ways of men in this new world, the great platform of all the development of the human race as populating this world after the flood, and the principles and judgments on which it is founded. Chapter 10 gives the facts, chapter 11 how it came about in judgment, for chapters 10 and 11 are not to be taken as chronologically consequent, for the division into nations and tongues was consequent on the attempt at unity in human pride in Babel. And then, lastly, we have the family Jehovah owned, to trace the descent in it to the vessel of promise, together with God's orderings of the world. The posterity of Noah is given by families and nations, a new thing in the earth, out of which, from the race of Ham, arises the first power which rules by its own force and founds an empire, for that which is according to flesh comes first. We have then, that the moral history of the world may be known as well as the external form it assumed, the universal association of men to exalt themselves against God, and make to themselves a name independently of him, see note 1, an effort stamped on God's part with the name of Babel, confusion, and which ends in judgment and in the dispersion of the race, thenceforth jealous of and hostile to one another. See note 2. Lastly, we have the genealogy of the race by which God was pleased to name himself, for God is Jehovah, see note 3, the God of Shem. Note 1. The idea of a building high enough to escape the flood is an idea of which there is not the smallest trace in this passage. It was the pride of man seeking a center and a name without God, and coalescing together. The rise of imperial power and dominion came after this, in which individual will and energy gained the ascendancy. They are two phases of human effort without God. End of note 1. Note 2. Pentecost was a beautiful testimony. God rose there above the confusion and judgment, and found, even in its effects, the means of getting near the heart of man, so that grace overruled judgment, even when it was not exercised in the power which regenerates the world. End of note 2. Note 3. All in chapter 9 is simply Elohim, God, till we get to verse 26, where it is Jehovah, the God of Shem. End of note 3. The history of our present world in its great principles, and original sources. The importance of these chapters will be felt. The preceding chapters gave us, after the creation, the great original principles of man's ruin, closing with judgment, in which the old world found its close. Here we have the history of our present world, and, as seen in Genesis, which uncovers the roots of all that was to be for the revelation of God's thoughts and the display of his government, in its great principles and original sources, which imprint their character on the results, till another judgment from God himself obliterates all but its responsibility, and gives room for another and a better world. The world set out by families. The result of this history is that the world is set out by families. The fashion of this world has obliterated the memory and the perception of this, but not the power. It is rooted in the judgment of God, and, when the acquired force of this world becomes weak, will be ever more apparent, as it now really works. The fountainheads were three, first named in the order, Shem, and Ham, and Japheth, the first being the family in which the covenant was to be established on earth, and with which God was to be in relationship. Then he who was in hostility with God's family, and last, though eldest and proudest, the Gentile Japheth. Japheth. In the detail, Japheth is given first. The isles of the Gentiles in general, that is, the countries with which we are familiar, and much of northern Asia, were peopled by his descendants. But the great moral questions and power of good and evil in the world arose elsewhere, and the evil now, for it was man's day, before the good. Ham. The East, as we call it, Palestine, down the Euphrates, Egypt, and sea, was in the hands of Ham. Their power first establishes itself by the will of one in Nimrod. A mighty hunter, force and craft, works to bring untamed man, as well as beast, under his yoke. And cities arise, but Babel was the beginning of his kingdom, others he went out and built, or conquered. Then come the well-known Egyptians, Mizraim. Another branch of this family is marked as forming the races in possession of the inheritance destined of God for his people. Shem. Shem comes last, the father of Hebrews, the brother of him who has long despised him, as possessed of an elder brother's title. Such is the general result in the peopling of the world under God's ordering. Men seeking a center for himself. The way was this. Men sought to make a center for himself. Adam, living in the earth, would have been so, and its link with God, as Christ will be hereafter, and ever was in the purpose of God, for Adam was the image of him that was to come. But will has none but itself. Noah, whose influence would have been just, has no place in the whole history, after his worship, save that he lost the place of authority by falling into sin, in the loss of self-restraint. See note. Will characterized all now, but in a multitude of wills, all impotent as centers, what can be done? A common center and interest is sought independent and exclusive of God. They were to fill the earth, but scattered in peaceful quietness. To be of no importance, they would not. They must get a name for themselves to be a center. And God scatters into nations by judgment what would not fill the earth by families in peace. Tongues and nations must be added to families, to designate men on the earth. The judged place becomes the seat of the energetic will of one, of the apostate power. The beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel. Tongues were a restraint and an iron band round men. Note. This is a striking fact in the character of the history of man after the flood. We get the full plain statement of what he becomes, end of note. God's history beginning in Shem. In Shem God's history begins. He is Jehovah, the God of Shem. We have dates and epochs, for after all God governs, and the world must follow, man belongs to God. Other people's ages were shortened surely beside those here named, here we know when. And when the earth was divided, for God after all disposed of it, men's years lost one half of what they were, as they had already done immediately after the flood. But of known history, God's people have ever been the center. This comes down to Abraham. And here again, a new element of evil had become universal, at least practically so, idolatry, Joshua 24 verse 2, though it had not been the subject hitherto. It is man in the world, and in Shem, the secret providential ordering of things by God. Still, it ended in the power of evil, even in the family of Shem. Universal idolatry. We have seen the wickedness and violence of man, his rebellion against God, and Satan's craft to bring him into this state, but here an immense step is made, an astonishing condition of evil appears on the scene. Satan thrusts himself, to man's mind, into the place of power, and seizes the idea of God in man's mind, placing himself between God and him, so that men worship demons as God. When it began, Scripture does not say, but the passage cited shows that it had contaminated even Shem's family, in the part of it too which Scripture itself counts up as God's genealogy in the earth at the time we have arrived at. Individuals might be biased, but in every sense, the link of the world with God was gone. They had given themselves up, even in the family which as a race was in relationship with God, to the worship and power of Satan. What a tale all tells of man! What a tale of the patience of God! A new system, Abraham called and chosen by grace. Here, therefore, we change entirely the whole system and order of thought, and a principle, in exercise without doubt from the beginning as to individual salvation, but not manifested in the order of things, declares itself, and comes into evidence in the history of the earth. Abraham is called, chosen, and made personally the depositary of the promises. But remark that here, in order that this great principle may be preserved in its own purity as an act of God, the occasion given in the fact we have referred to is not mentioned. We find it in Joshua 24. God comes down, after judgment, in sovereign grace to have a family of his own by the calling of grace, an immense principle. Abraham the father of the faithful, the head of the accepted race of God on the earth. But it is well to dwell a moment on what was really a most important epoch in the history of God's ways with the world, where the proper history of faith begins, though of course there were believers individually before. But as Adam was the head of the ruined race, so Abraham was the father of the faithful, the head of the race of God on the earth, both after the flesh and after the spirit. Christ, the fullness of all blessing, we know, in whom we have far higher blessings than those revealed in Abraham. Still, in God's ways upon the earth, Abraham was the head of the accepted race. Idolatry, as we have seen, had at this time gained a footing in the family of Shem himself. Your fathers, says Joshua 24 verse 2, dwelt in old time beyond the flood, Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Now, these gods were demons. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 20. It is a citation of Deuteronomy 32 verse 17. That is, now that God had interfered in judgment, see not, and in power, these demons had possessed themselves of this position in the spirit of man, and taken the place in his mind of the sources of the authority displayed and of blessing still bestowed. They presented themselves to him as authors of those judgments, of all which drew forth the worship, the gratitude, and the terror of the natural heart of corrupted man, expressed in his worship according to the principles on which he was, on which he alone could be, in relationship with those superior beings, to whom he attributed the power to answer his desires or to avert the things which he feared. It was not merely man corrupted and in rebellion against God, it was his religion itself which corrupted him, and he made of his corruption a religion. The demons had taken the place of God in his mind, and having the ascendancy over his conscience, if man did not forget it, hardened or misled it. He was religiously bad, and there is no degradation like that. What a state! What folly! How long, O Lord? Note: in the deluge. It does not seem that idolatry had crept in before. End of note. God introduces us into his own thoughts. But if the human race plunge thus into darkness, taking demons for their God, and, incapable of self-sustainment, substitute for their own rebellion against God's servitude to what is more elevated in rebellion, placing themselves in miserable dependence upon it, God raises and lifts us up above all this evil, and by his calling introduces us into his own thoughts, thoughts far more precious than the restoration of what was fallen. He separates a people to hopes which suit the majesty and the love of him who calls them and places them in a position of proximity to himself, which the blessing of the world under his government would never have given them. He is their God. He communicates with them in a way which is in accordance with this intimacy, and we here speak, for the first time, of faith. Genesis 15 verse 6, based on these communications and these direct testimonies of God, though it may have operated from the beginning,